Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 163, April 29th to May 5th, 1864. Last week, we wrapped up the Red River Campaign. While not the most significant campaign, I think it kind of marks the end of anyone not being on the same page as Grant, who is taking overall direction of the war effort. We talked about naval action outside of Plymouth, another inconclusive affair, and the ending of prisoner exchanges. We closed out with a setup of the battle that is the subject matter of our entire episode today, the Battle of the Wilderness. Of course, before we go into the Battle of the Wilderness, we do need to talk about some Patreon content. And of course, we had a picture slideshow here at the end of this month of April that would go very nicely with the Battle of the Wilderness because that's where we went. And then here as we get into May, we're going to go back to a movie review, and we're going to need to go a few episodes in the future to reach the subject matter of that movie. That's going to be the Battle of Newmarket. And The Field of Lost Shoes is the movie. It's a kind of a peculiar movie in my opinion, and I will review that, talk about the historical accuracy. So that's something that sounds like it would interest you. Of course, there's a link to the Patreon in the show description, and the proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. So first, we need to describe the battlefield. As mentioned before, even in the Battle of Chancellorsville, this area is known as the Wilderness because of the dense woodland that there sat. There's not much in terms of open area here, but the roads are going to be important. There are 3 east-west roadways that are very critical: the Orange Turnpike, Orange Plank Road, and Catharpin Road in order of north to south. These were probably mentioned back in 1863 when we talked about the flank attack of Jackson, his famous event of that battle. Relatively north-south is the Germanna Ford Road, which will run to Wilderness Tavern, and then eventually connect to the Brock Road, running to Todd's Tavern and Spotsylvania Courthouse beyond. The Widow Tap Farm would be near the intersection of the Brock Road and Orange Plank Roads, in an unfinished railroad cut running just to the south of the roadway. The Lacey, Chewing, and Higgerson farms will be slightly north of Taps, between the Plank and Turnpike. A road would connect the Plank Road and Turnpike a little west of the Brock Road, running toward Parker's store, which was an objective of the march. Let us also briefly recap the strategic situation, speaking of the march. The Army of the Potomac is marching through the wilderness in an effort to get into the relative open country beyond. Remember that was also sort of a goal of Joe Hooker in the Chancellorsville battles. The first day he actually does get out into some open area. There's going to be an engagement, and then he's going to go back into the wilderness, which is not going to be good for his numerical superiority. It's going to kind of negate that. Robert E. Lee is supposed to be falling back to his mine run defenses, or maybe even as far back as the North Anna River, as was the assumption of Andrew Humphreys, who had planned the Union March, being the chief of staff for Meade. With his army strung out and not consolidated, it would seem to be a safe bet that he would do this. Passing through that terrain would be important to Grant and Meade, and it seemed likely they would do so and make contact with the enemy beyond. Lee was not going to play ball, though. He would set his 2 available corps in motion, unfortunately without additional troops he may have received from Richmond. We will talk in future episodes about the action in the Valley that draws some of his cavalry, and the operations in the Bermuda Hundred campaign that will occupy some infantry. Beast Butler will be moving up, and a patchwork of defenders will be necessary to stop him, which will include PGT Beauregard and more men from the Carolinas. Regardless, Lee would set out to engage the enemy, his corps of Ewell and A.P. Hill each advancing along the Turnpike and Plank Roads respectively. James Wilson, who is an inexperienced cavalry officer, will fail to fan out enough patrols to cover all the approaches, and thus leave the 2 closest corps open to attack. Warren and his 5th Corps, followed by Sedgwick and his 6th Corps. Hancock and the 2nd were further west, having trekked through Chancellorsville. Burnside's 9th Corps would be in reserve, ready to plug whatever gap was necessary. Burnside, much like his friend McClellan, would be characterized as having a case of the slows, however, so he would be lagging when it came to a quick response. Remember, too, that there is a problem where Meade does not have operational control over the 9th Corps because Burnside technically outranks him, so Grant is going to have to communicate between the three. It's not going to be particularly efficient. Charles Griffin has been in our story for some time. If you recall, he was part of the 5th Corps, and they were isolated and engaged the Confederates in the Gaines Mill portion of the 7 Days. In fact, if you go to the battlefield, which is one of my favorites, you will find Griffin's Woods named after him. It would be Griffin acting as the tailing Charlie of Warren's command as they rumble slowly to Parker's store. His job was to remain around the Lacey House, where the road to Parker's store intersected the turnpike, and there wait for Sedgwick. As you can imagine, the arrival and beginning deployment of Confederates in the trees on the other side of Saunders Field, down the road from your flank, is not welcome news. And so, both armies will start to maneuver. Griffin would be joined by Wadsworth's command, and Hancock would start to head west from his position. Lee, it should be said, was trying to maybe get another Chancellorsville out of the situation. If Longstreet arrived in the afternoon, all he had to have happen was keep the Union Corps at bay with Ewell and Hill. Luckily for Lee, the Union command was sort of sputtering, forcing Grant to decide he would take command of the situation. During this campaign, he had made the decision that he would go through Meade, but it would be the Wilderness that would convince him to be more hands-on in his approach when it came to overall control, making things complicated with the as-mentioned Burnside. So the Confederates under Ewell will have a nice piece of high ground on the far side of Saunders Field in which they can dig in. Meanwhile, Wilson continued on his march, leaving behind the 5th New York Cavalry at Parker's store. You remember that being a marching destination for the Union left wing. Wilson himself would lead his command to the Catharpin Road further south. Remember, these are 3 parallel lines on a map east to west, so if you hold 3 fingers sideways, we have Ewell digging in to face Warren and the arriving 6th Corps on the top, the 5th New York waiting for Crawford's command in the middle, but having A.P. Hill bearing toward him, led by Heath's division, and then Wilson on the bottom. Thomas Rosser and his cavalry are going to be advancing on the Catharpin Road, so he will soon be engaged. The 5th New York would engage Kirkland's North Carolina Brigade armed with Spencer repeating rifles. Holding the Confederates at bay and keeping them from reaching the intersection of the roads would be important. Hill could cut off Wilson and Hancock, or he could roll up the 5th Corps. Fortunately, just as the other battles, the superior firepower would be the X factor. Rosser, meanwhile, would run into Wilson near a place called Craig's Meeting House along the Catharpin Road. Both sides would dismount and engage for a time, the Union troopers initially getting the better of their gray opponents. Rosser's cavalry would eventually rally and push Wilson all the way back to Todd's Tavern. It would be there that Gregg's division arrives, and a series of charges and countercharges would occur. Rosser would eventually be forced to withdraw, and Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry would arrive to stabilize the situation. Phil Sheridan had tried to catch Jeb Stuart, and in so doing, he had left Wilson alone. Reportedly, during this cavalry action, Rosser only lost some 114 casualties, compared to around 700 Union troopers, making this not a very good day for the Federal horse. While Wilson is tussling with Rosser for the majority of the day, Warren was given orders to attack, but he also knew he needed to get everything in line. Major fighting was about to erupt. The 5th New York under John Hammond was forced to withdraw from Parker's store with the added weight from Heath. They would withdraw all the way to the Brock Road intersection along the Plank Road past the Widow Tap House. Now, Crawford and his Pennsylvania reserves were going to be in a position facing south on the road to Parker's store, and they were getting orders from Warren to consolidate. He had a good defensive position if Hill did something crazy, like turn up the Ford Road and hit Warren in the flank, so he stayed put. In the meantime, Getty's division of the 6th Corps would push on toward the Brock Road intersection, where they would have to deal with Heath, rearranging his command to relieve Kirkland with Cooke. Warren was finding it difficult to form up his command given the terrain, exactly why fighting in the wilderness was not ideal. Meade and Grant were losing patience, however. Despite Griffin not wanting to attack and Crawford refusing to budge, the fight for Saunders Field was about to begin. Warren was justly afraid of his flanks being exposed, and Griffin was justly afraid of the open ground his men would have to traverse to get at the rebels. Dennison's Maryland Brigade of Robinson's division was supposed to fill the gap between him and Wadsworth, but they would get lost in the woods. As it was, Bartlett and Ayres would advance into the fray in waves. The soldiers participating in these attacks would realize that once in the field, they would have a tough time getting out. Bullets would tear into them from the front, as well as artillery rounds, Johnson and Rhodes being in a good position, and Early having the ability to throw in where needed. So desperate was the charge that the commander of the 148th New York would tell any non-combatants in his command to pick up rifles as they became available. So desperate the charge was. The 146th New York would plunge into the second wave. This Zouave regiment, made up of veterans from the 5th New York, would be torn to pieces. Bartlett, commanding many of the same regiments who had fought on Little Round Top, would barely escape the field. Cutler's Iron Brigade would find a gap between Rum Jones and Doles's brigade in Rhodes's command. They, along with Bartlett's wave in the front, would pour fire into the flank, killing Jones and Early's nephew. Regiments in Bartlett's brigade would actually push Jones and his men back as a result, these including the 44th New York and 83rd Pennsylvania. The 140th New York of Ayres' command would reach the breastworks of the enemy, but they were severely weakened in their charge. They and the U.S. regulars were very depleted. The 146th and 140th would withdraw together, but many in Griffin's division would surrender rather than risk making it back across the open ground. The 140th would suffer 51% casualties in the charge, although some of them and the 146th men would do good work in saving Union guns, which North Carolina regiments attempted to capture that were in the field. The 9th Massachusetts would try to take them, but they too were roughly dealt with. Schweitzer would order them in, not knowing they had already suffered some 138 casualties. Orders from Griffin would stave a second assault, and later Schweitzer would apologize. The Iron Brigade, meanwhile, would capture many prisoners of Jones's command, but they would become separated from Rice and Stone, the two other brigades in Wadsworth's command. John B. Gordon would counterattack the Midwesterners, and the Iron Brigade would break at the weight of his command, as well as being partially hit in the flank by Cullen Battle. Wadsworth would grow frantic, as this crack unit had never run before, and the rest of his brigades were facing combat veterans in the form of Daniel and Doles. Their attacks across Higginson Field, south of Saunders, would come to nothing. Dennison's Marylanders, who had recently arrived from garrison duty to the army, would stem the tide for a time, but also withdraw. McCandless would come to the south of the field and be hit with part of Gordon's command. The entire 7th Pennsylvania Reserve would surrender, fooled by the 61st Georgia, who, in the wooded terrain, would convince them that they were an entire brigade. Warner would start to reform at his jump-off point of the Lacey Farm near Wilderness Tavern, joined by Wright's 6th Corps Division arriving down the road. Indeed, the attack was ill-advised and not properly supported by Wright. Griffin would say as such to Meade, prompting some, including the nearby Grant, to ponder his arrest, but Meade knew Griffin to be a capable officer. There is a point to be made that some of these attacks did see a little success, but they were not supported well, so Griffin does have a point in this case. Just a very short plug for our picture slideshow, but you can actually see in the modern day this would be a pretty tough position to actually assault if you're going up a hill in this open ground and there's artillery and lots of infantry that have dug in a well-entrenched position, then obviously it's going to be quite tough to actually take it via assault without any kind of support from the flanks. So you're actually able to go right where the 146th New York charges through, and you can kind of see just how difficult it would be. So where exactly was Wright? While initial contact was in the morning, these attacks did not jump off until 1 p.m., so that should have given Wright enough time to get there, right? And yes, I did use a right there as a joke. Well, he had been instructed to act as the right flank of the army and was waiting for reinforcements to move out. They did arrive on the field and extend the Union line north of Saunders Field. Upton, Russell, Brown, and Neal of Getty's division would all form into line and attack the Confederates. The Stonewall Brigade under Walker and Stafford's Louisiana men would actually advance beyond their lines, out of their earthworks, toward an unknown number of the enemy and be repulsed. Falling back to their own lines, Stafford, who had been a militiaman in the Mexican-American War and Texas Ranger, would be hit with a shot that severed his spine. He lingered for 3 days, and also long enough on the field to watch his former command under Hayes enter the fray. We have a description of the fighting on this part of the field. It was impossible to see the enemy, and though we peered into the thick woods, we were fighting invisible foemen. We soon began entrenching. Our men scraped the stones and earth before them as best they could, until spades were brought. All the time the enemy were sending a shower of bullets over and past us. It would at times lessen, then start again fresh. We lay on the crest of the hill, stooping as low as every fusillade swept over. It was wonderful that our casualties were not greater in that leaden storm. We were replied by occasional volleys, but could not see what damage we inflicted. We were screened by bushes on our front. The enemy before was screened in the same manner. Between the two lay an open, cleared flat of small extent through which passed the Orange Plank. Harry Hayes and Pegram's commands would arrive and lengthen the Confederate line. Pegram was commanding extra Billy Smith's old command, and Hayes had a pseudo-brigade, his still depleted from the disaster at Rappahannock Station, which you recall happening after the Gettysburg Campaign. They too would briefly try to stand and fight, but were repulsed as well, extending the Confederate line and starting to dig in. We have another description of this part. The battle had raged furiously along the entire line. The rattle of musketry would swell into a full continuous roar as the simultaneous discharge of 10,000 guns mingled in one grand concert, and then, after a few minutes, became more interrupted. Then would be heard the wild yells which always told of a rebel charge, and again the volleys would become more terrible, and the broken, crashing tones would swell into one continuous roll of sound, which presently would be interrupted by the vigorously manly cheers of the Northern soldiers, so different from the shrill yell of the rebels, and which indicated a repulse of their enemies. Now and then the monotony of the muskets was broken by a few discharges of artillery, which seemed to come in as double bass in this concert of death. But so impenetrable was the forest that little use was made of artillery, and the work of destruction was carried on with the rifle. You can actually go to this part of the field in the present day and see just how difficult it would be to fight through this kind of wilderness, through this kind of brush. And certainly artillery, as mentioned, is sort of going to be useless here. A line of sight, pretty difficult unless it's in an open area. Truman Seymour would arrive with his brigade in an attempt to find the end of the Confederate line. Seymour, as we have highlighted, has had unfortunate luck, and the wilderness was not going to be his day either. His attacks were repulsed with heavy casualties, especially from the 110th Ohio. Now there is evidence to suggest that there should have been a general assault, or even Burnside was supposed to send help, but Seymour essentially attacked alone. Where Burnside was a mystery. He had been guarding the supply lines, but with his large 4-division 9th Corps, they could certainly have been used in the fighting. Now they never got to the field despite being ordered to, and this is odd, but Burnside, as we will soon see, is very cautious. With the repulse of Seymour, action would relatively cease on this part of the field. Now, if you are Dick Ewell, you probably are extremely satisfied with your performance. This is probably one of the better ones that Ewell has turned in. He's able to repulse 2 corps, the 6th and the 5th, attacks from both. No disaster has happened. Probably if you're Ewell, you didn't have to make any decisions, so there you go. But there are going to be several points that we'll continually talk about as we continue with the overland campaign. Number one, the Confederates are going to be very good at earthworks. Ewell has turned in his best performance. Shouldn't get used to that, unfortunately, right? And it's all downhill from here, but we also have that these crack units, whether they are being mustered out of the Army because of their enlistment periods expiring, or whether they are just attrition through casualties, the Union Army does not replace individuals in the regiments, right? So there are regiments that are coming in that are going to be rookies, whereas the Confederates are going to mix in with the veterans and hopefully have better cohesion and more experience there to go along with the lack thereof for some of the soldiers. So you are going to see these combat troops that have been crack units for the Army of the Potomac, such as the Iron Brigade, just become less and less effective as the campaign continues. Let's now backtrack to the Middle Road, where Heath has pushed the enemy cavalry all the way to the Brock Road intersection. Getty's division had there met him and was deploying for combat. Now Lee had told Heath not to bring on a general engagement, something that echoed from his orders at Gettysburg. Heath had decided to heed these orders and stop to dig in. You remember, of course, it doesn't really work out very well for Heath, having decided to press on a general engagement at Gettysburg, something that Lee wasn't ready for. But there are other episodes where we talked about that. There's a lot of arguments there back and forth. His brigades of Walker, Cook, and Stone were thrown into a battle line. Kirkland's men, who had borne the brunt of the fighting with the cavalry, were in reserve, ready to plug in wherever needed. Heath, it should be said, who has had some rocky performances, would actually do a pretty good job of meeting any of the incoming attacks and also shifting troops around to meet threats where necessary. Lewis Grant's Vermont regiments, along with Frank Wheaton and Henry Eustis, would all form into attack, slamming into the fixed positions of the Confederates. The Green Mountain Boys, who we met all the way back during the action around Yorktown, would be cut to pieces, their casualties exceeding 1,000. Wheaton and Eustis did not fare better, Elisha Hunt Rhodes being part of Eustis's command and writing about the combat. Fortunately for the Federals, Hancock, now having changed direction to make it to the field, was arriving. David Birney's troops were the first to reach Getty's embattled command. Hobart Ward would actually throw some regiments into the fray to help with Grant's Vermont regiments. This included the 124th New York, the Orange Blossoms, who you probably remember from Gettysburg. Gershom Mott's division would arrive as well, geared to attack Heath, and Alexander Hayes, who did good service in repulsing Pettigrew at Gettysburg, would attack the right flank. Mott included the Excelsiors. Now, these being APL's men, some of them had either participated in the first day or even third day at Gettysburg. They would beat off these attacks and threats to the flank with well-timed spoiling charges. In fact, some of these counter-thrusts probably reached almost as far as the Brock Road itself. Alexander Hayes was hit in the temple and mortally wounded during this action, Hancock stymied by this lone division. He was primed to bring in his remaining divisions for help, including John Gibbon and Francis Barlow. Gibbon would send in some of his men, along with a fresh portion of some of the brigades already on the field, but by this time, Cademus Wilcox had countermarched, his assignment originally being to link up with Ewell. His added weight to the line would stabilize the position, fresh brigades replacing the worn-out men of Heath. Barlow's men, which included Smith and the Irish Brigade, would launch an attack, but Lane's North Carolinians and darkness would put the action to a close. They had seen some success, though, capturing a large amount of Confederates. 2 regiments from Brooks' command actually worked their way around the flank into a position where they can be in the rear of the enemy, but they were lost in the darkness in the thick woods. The 5th had seen fierce fighting, and the 6th promised no different. So if you are Ewell and A.P. Hill, you have done a bang-up job for the Confederates. Heath also turned in a subpar performance at Gettysburg, so his action near the Brock Road was key. I should point out, though, as I've mentioned before, that these were 2 under the direct supervision of Lee, which would be necessary. If Lee was not in the best of health, however, they were left to their own devices, and that could be a problem. One thing that was concerning, though, was the front that Wilcox and Heath faced. Their commands were mixed, and flanks exposed. Wadsworth had pressured their left and Barlow the right late in the day. Despite their urgings to reorganize, they were assured not only by A.P. Hill, but Lee himself, that Longstreet and Richard Anderson were both on the way. This is actually going to play in a big part of the early fighting on the next day. But just know that these commands are going to be kind of jumbled together. They're not going to be cohesive. What have we always said in this podcast about having to have a cohesive front, a cohesive command structure? So that's going to be a problem if you are on this section of the field for the Confederates. If you're Hill too, right? Like we talked about Ewell and how he turns in a great performance. If you're Hill, you're probably pretty satisfied as well, right? There was the sparks that you saw with A.P. Hill that lead him to become a corps commander. You just really haven't seen too much of that recently, and now you have a very good performance here at the Wilderness. Now, if you are Lee, Longstreet did not make it there in time for his flank assault, but you know he's there on the field the next day. You've checked the Union advance so far, and then you're going to have another corps to play with, and then you also have a portion of A.P. Hill's command, a division under Richard Anderson, which had not been engaged. So there you go. You have enough men, even though you're outnumbered, you have enough men, you have the Wilderness, that's going to negate numbers, just as it did at Chancellorsville. You have to be feeling pretty good if you're Lee. Now, if you're Grant, you probably are also feeling pretty good despite the large amount of casualties you've taken. You're still in a pretty good spot. You can launch a general offensive the next day, perhaps, to great effect. Hancock can crush Hill with the help from Getty, while also using Barlow to check for Longstreet, who is supposedly coming in on the flank. Warren and Sedgwick can renew their attacks as well, being enough to take out Ewell. Burnside would use one division under Stevenson to support Hancock, with Potter and Wilcox to wedge into the middle and potentially help either wing. Ferrero and his Black Division would remain in reserve. Everything seemed to be working. Burnside requested, though, to move the planned jump-off time back from 4 to 5 a.m. Some generals in the East would have been aware that this did not bode well for him being where he was supposed to be, but Grant would allow this. Despite there being some promise for the 6th on the part of the Federals, the beginning of the day did not bode well for many of the suspected moving parts, other than Hancock, who we will get to in a minute. As expected, Burnside was not in position, and was reportedly not enthusiastic to get there. Warren was getting flashbacks from Mine Run. If you remember, there was a grand assault he had called off during that battle because he did not want to waste lives. Well, Ewell had been busy the night before. He had set up artillery in advantageous positions and had deployed sharpshooters. Any attack would be costly, and Burnside had not yet arrived. Potentially, there was going to be part of the Confederate line that could be exploited, where Ramseur was slated to plug in, but this was going to be left untouched. Winfield Scott Hancock, though, would get his attack off on time. He had his own corps and that of Wadsworth still in position to hit Hill in the flank. His own divisions and that of Getty would organize with Gibbon taking one wing and Birney the other. Birney's and Mott's division would be in the lead, followed by Getty and Gibbon's own. Barlow was deployed to the south so that he could continue his job of checking for Longstreet. Cutler's, Baxter's, and Rice's brigades would then fall on the flank. All in all, it would be about 20,000 men against Hill's 5,000. Not very good odds indeed if you were in Butternut. The attack would begin on time. Because of tremendous pressure on Hill's line, many of them would retreat without discharging their weapons. Many would surrender with Union troops yelling, "Come on, Johnny," as they made their way toward enemy lines. Cook and Stone, who had fought so well the previous day, would stand for a time, but eventually be thrown back with the rest toward the tap field. Pogue's artillery was there parked and would turn in a good performance in trying to keep the Union masses at bay. While Hancock had reported they were driving the enemy beautifully because of the amount of men and the terrain, they were becoming mixed up, losing cohesion. Pogue's guns worked hard to check the Union advance, firing into the trees and then at any blue mob that appeared in the open. While the Rockbridge County, Virginia lawyer would be convinced his artillery had checked the advance, Hancock had also decided he needed to reform. It was then that the critical moment of the battle occurred. A.P. Hill would actually partially display just how critical this was, as the artillery is firing into this oncoming mass. They're worried they're going to hit Confederates, and A.P. Hill is like, in order to save the day, this is what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to fire in there. And that's just kind of illustrating just how desperate this time is. Lee had never been so close to disaster on the battlefield. Where was Longstreet must have been the question on many minds, including the Army commander. Field and Kershaw would arrive at Taps at that instant. Kershaw began to deploy south of the road, and Field, led by the Texas Brigade under Gregg to the north. The Texans had been away from the Army and were happy to see Lee, and Lee happy to see them. He would actually call out, "Texans always move 'em," as they moved into the battle. So caught up in the near defeat that Lee would actually try to go in with the brigade. These veterans would stop and urge him to return to safety as opposed to putting himself in danger. Eventually, he was led to Longstreet, a good distance from harm, but I think it really does illustrate just how dire the nature of the moment from the usually sanguine Gray Fox. Kershaw's old brigade of South Carolina troops would enter the battle to the south of the road, while Gregg's Texans plunged into the Union line to the north. Kershaw's own brigade was in the thick of the fighting on the south side, and many of the regimental commanders would go down. Humphrey's Mississippi Brigade, the old Barksdale outfit, would plug the central gap in the line. These men were primarily facing Hobart Ward's contingent. Meanwhile, the Texans blunted Wadsworth's command and entered into a firefight at close range. They would lose 2/3 of their number before withdrawing, allowing time for Rock Benning's Georgians to enter the action. Benning's men would also plunge across the field and engage heavily with the Union troops beyond. Throwing brigades into the desperate fight one at a time, Perry's Alabama men, formerly of Law, would follow in close behind them. Perry would actually divide his men into 3 parts, each attacking the enemy at different points. His was a larger command than that of Gregg's Texans or Benning's Georgians. 2 heavy artillery units under Kitching threatened his left flank, and so the 15th Alabama under Oates was dispatched to deal with them, falling on their flank and scattering them. Oates would perform the same service when Birney's command reformed and moved forward. Perry's other regiments would continue to chew up the front line and parry a counterattack from Webb, who was sent to find Getty's division. Getty had been wounded, and so the command fell to Wheaton, whose brigade, along with Eustis, were receiving the brunt of Field's attack. Carroll's Gibraltar Brigade would then be split on both sides of the road. Hancock was now in a position trying to stabilize his line. The Philadelphia Brigade under Owen would start to deploy, but ahead of them would be the Vermont Boys under Grant. The Green Mountain Boys had already been torn up the day before, so going again was not appealing. Lewis Grant wrote that the orders to advance over the same ground as the day before were like a death warrant. Now he was facing 3 brigades united, Good Bryan's men falling into the right of the Palmetto Staters. Grant and his Vermont troops would hold the line. Both sides would settle into a stalemate, trying to reform their ranks. A lot of the time when you look into the Civil War and these sources, there's a lot of being the first at something or being the last at something, so there's going to be a lot of lasts as we get into 64, 65, of course, as opposed to when we had a whole bunch of firsts there in 61, 62, right? Well, there are a lot of sources that point out the Wilderness as being the last time in which the Texas Brigade is going to be used as an elite attacking combat unit. Now, they're still going to be in the Army of Northern Virginia. They're still going to turn in good performances, but they're just not going to be the same, right? And that's something that we're going to say about a lot of these units that we've sort of grown to know, is that they're just not going to be the same following the Overland campaign. The question, though, was what exactly was Burnside doing with his 9th Corps? Potter and Wilcox rumbled into position where they were staring down the road toward Parker's store. Standing in their way was a single brigade under Stephen Ramseur. If Burnside pressed the issue, his 2 divisions would be wedged in between the 2 wings of Lee's army, occupying strong ground around the Chewing Farm. But Burnside would see troops moving around behind Ramseur. This would actually be A.P. Hill's Corps trying to reform, and so the 9th Corps would hesitate. Stevenson's division would reach Hancock and so be part of the reforming there. Paul Frank's brigade would meanwhile try an ill-advised attack on the Confederate right. Frank insulted McAllister, asking to move through his command while insinuating that they were cowards. McAllister would allow Frank's men to move forward and also receive a bloody repulse. Hancock then would try to shore up his men. He was concerned that Sheridan had reported that he was trying to hit Longstreet in the rear and flank. There were sounds of battle, but this would be skirmishing between Lee and Gregg, and also Rosser's action against Custer. Rosser would launch a series of attacks from his regiments led by the 35th Virginia Comanches against the Michigan Wolverines. A gully would separate the 2 sides, with small arms firing punctuating the action. Horse artillery would arrive, and both sides would engage in a firefight, but Rosser would be repulsed and forced to retreat. Casualties are not clear, but both sides would report quite a few, meaning that this was probably one of the fiercer cavalry engagements in this portion of the war. But needless to say, this is something that is going to be concerning these sounds of action. If you remember, once again, we have the 3 roads, and if this is happening around the Catharpin Road, that's to the south. So in this particular scenario where you can't see very much, the wilderness action, the sounds of fighting that are going to be happening on your flank are going to be kind of concerning. Longstreet would meanwhile think that he could launch an offensive action. He would be able to call upon 2 brigades from Richard Anderson's division finally coming up, as well as unused brigades from each of his divisions. Hancock, on the other hand, reformed his lines and started to recall Barlow, thinking Sheridan was accomplishing his goal of hitting Longstreet's command. Martin Smith, who you have met before having designed the defenses of Vicksburg, was now the chief engineer of the Army of Northern Virginia. He would discover that Hancock's left was undefended, and there was an unfinished railroad cut to provide cover. Fresh brigades under Wofford, Tige Anderson, and Little Billy Mahone would all be slated for an attack. Moxley Sorrell, who you might remember as mentioning as reviewing his memoir, would be tasked with leading this command, this task force, that would hit the federal flank, which was in the air. Sorrell would be joined by Stone's Mississippians, connecting with Goodbrine's command. It should be said that to keep cohesion, to get into position for a flank attack would be impressive on the part of Sorrell given the terrain. He did not attack right away, but made sure all of his brigades were ready in the unfinished cut. Once all were prepared, he would lead the assault, asking him to hold the colors of one regiment but being denied. The attack would have the desired effect on the unsuspecting Northern troops. McAllister and Brewster's command would soon be put to flight, although there was at least some stiffer resistance from elements south of the road. The rest of the Confederate line under Kershaw and Field would rumble forward as well, putting the enemy to a retreat. James Wadsworth, north of the road, would try to meet this new Confederate threat, but rebel artillery would make a potential stand even more difficult. For as much as we have said the Southern artillery was at a disadvantage, the Wilderness could be one example where it is actually a tad superior. With Abner Perrin's Alabama regiments preparing to attack, Wadsworth would attempt to lead the 20th Massachusetts in a spoiling charge at the enemy. The rebels, though, would be ready, and they would parry the attempt. When riding back to the line, Wadsworth would be hit in the head, a wound that would prove mortal. Unfortunately, his body would be left on the field, and would be cared for Confederates for a time, although he had been stripped of his valuables and boots, Wadsworth actually being one of the more wealthy men in America at the time. You actually get some of the more famous rhetoric of the war when there's a staff officer that actually comes and sees Wadsworth. He finds out it's Wadsworth. They've sort of built a tent-like structure to keep him out of the sun. So remember, this is May in Virginia, so it is going to be pretty warm. And he does write about how he can't really understand how James Wadsworth must feel dying so far from family and friends. So it's one of the more famous pieces of rhetoric that you can see associated with the Wilderness in the battle. On the north side of the road, the Yankees would be peeled back as well. James Longstreet would ride forward to plan the continued offensive. He would be joined by Micah Jenkins, whose brigade would lead the attack down the road itself. At the same time, the 12th Virginia, which is part of Mahone's brigade, would actually become separated, having launched their flank attack. They would be marching back toward the Confederate line and see the mounted party of men, as well as the South Carolinians, who were wearing a darker gray, and they would fire upon them. A bullet would hit Jenkins in the skull, a wound that would prove mortal, and even more crucially, a bullet would also pierce Longstreet in the neck. Stopping the bleeding, they would take him to the rear. Now, the success of Sorrell's flank attack and the wounding of Longstreet have been debated. Certainly, the attack was successful, but was petering out. Reform was what was needed, and what exactly Longstreet was going to do is debatable. Would it have been an uphill task for the Confederates to carry the field? Yes, it probably would have been. Does an immediate subordinate of Longstreet probably have a better idea of what exactly the plan was going to be? They probably do. However, it's going to be Richard Anderson who's going to be tabbed with taking over for the Corps because he's the senior officer on the field. He doesn't really have a tactical situation of what's going on the ground, so him being thrown into position would be a bit of a momentum killer. The overall notion is that Longstreet would have moved quickly to attack Hancock before the Federals dug in. As it was, they were making some pretty formidable earthworks. The Confederates would have been hard-pressed to do so. It's pretty questionable as to whether this would be the changing of the tide, so to speak, for the Battle of the Wilderness. The terrain certainly played into the advantage of the Confederates during the battle, and it must be said that the veteran rebels did their best in situations of keeping cohesion. You had scenarios where troops would pop out of the woods and almost capture or kill Lee, Hill, and Stewart during the first day, and again Hill was almost captured on the second day. Indeed, Burnside would arrive on the flank and use Powers and Wilcox's division to press Perry's Alabamians and Perry's Floridians. So much pressure was placed on the two brigades that they would break, reportedly the only time during the war the Alabama men would do so. Counterattacks from Benning, Stone, and Harris would blunt the Ninth Corps attacks, and at this point Burnside would have been aware that Wadsworth and Hancock had been thrown back. So all that to say that there's a lot of moving parts here, there's a lot of confusion with the woods, guys popping out, showing up randomly, right? Lee almost gets captured, or at least maybe could have been fired upon by federal troops, which would have been a disaster, right? So you get the idea that with Sorrell's attack, it's kind of a lucky thing that happens that they are able to attack effectively, get into a position where they are actually flanking the Union line, and then they attack effectively. So in this kind of situation, it's just going to be advantageous to a defender in a well-entrenched position to handle any kind of assault. So the thought that Longstreet's attack, if Longstreet hadn't been wounded, it would have been successful. Grant would have been thrown back across the Rapidan. I probably wouldn't go that far, and it's very questionable as to whether the attack would have been successful or not. Lee was going to reform and try to press the advantage, or at least what was left of it. Longstreet had been contemplating another flank attack, this time directed at the crossroad itself. Instead of flanking, Lee would try a frontal assault. Now, I've seen some sources say that he did not learn from Pickett's charge, or that he did not suffer the kind of setbacks maybe the Union Army had given frontal attacks during this very battle. But I think, too, that Lee understands that he's losing the initiative, so he needs to do something to try to make sure that Grant retreats back across the Rapidan. Also, much like Pickett's charge, the attack actually almost works. The outnumbered nature of the rebels will come into play, especially considering that this would be the last offensive of the war, or the last major attack of the war for Lee. Remember, we talked about how we have these lasts and firsts. Records from much of these campaigns have been destroyed, so we do not know the extent of the attacks. However, we do know from eyewitness accounts that some rebels did break through the line. John Bratton, who you might remember from Wauhatchie, would command Jenkins' brigade after the demise of their commanding officer. Some of these regiments would be able to push through Hobart Ward's command. Ward, it should be said, was sitting on a caisson throughout the attack, and would order said caisson to the rear, with him still sitting on it. Battle fatigue would be a real problem for several officers during the battle, James Wadsworth perhaps being the biggest culprit, maybe behaving in the same manner as Phil Kearny at Chantilly. Some even said Lee was suffering from a kind of fatigue, especially when facing the potential destruction of his army at Widow Tap's Field. Carroll's brigade and Rice's and Stone's combined outfits would repulse the thrust into the Brock Road intersection. This action petering out would mark the end of the battle on this more southern part of the field. In the north, the battle had essentially ground to a halt, since Warren had decided not to attack. Ewell was given instructions that should an opportunity present itself, he could take advantage of attacking the 5th or 6th Corps. There had been a repulse of troops on the extreme northern portion of the battlefield before, if you recall, so it would be possible maybe for the Confederates to gain traction in this area, or at least John B. Gordon thought so. Gordon was Johnny on the spot the day prior, so May 6th he would see a golden opportunity. Flanking the enemy to the north would prove that the Union Army had its flank in the air. His superiors, Early and Dick Ewell, would not be so sure. To them, Burnside was there with his massive corps, and any flanking maneuver would prove to be fatal. Gordon, though, would accompany cavalry on a scout and discovered that it was in fact the case that the flank was in the air. The rebel line extended beyond that of the Union, here in the 6th Corps sector. It might be possible to roll up the 2 corps. The arrival of a brigade of Tar Heels extended the line even further. Gordon would have 2 brigades to move out against the Union line. If they saw some success, then the rest of Early's command, as he rolled the enemy up, could then advance, making the attack that much greater. The only problem would be that the attack would jump off later in the day. As the Union troops were digging in or otherwise making camp, they were not suspecting of the Georgians as they pulled out of their entrenchments. Gordon would smash Shaler and Seymour, capturing both of those generals in the process. Unfortunately for Gordon, though, Johnson would lose cohesion and be ineffective in the attack, his brigade actually veering off, not really running into very much at all. Other Confederate regiments or brigades would also not jump off out of their defenses. Union troops in the meantime would stiffen the line in the defense, especially amongst Upton's regiments and Morris's command. Gordon would beg Pegram's regiments to join him, but they would be thrown back. This flank attack would be extremely effective, but the lateness of the hour and the lack of proper support would draw the action and the battle to a close. Sedgwick, it should be said, did good work in refusing his lines, bringing them back to make sure that Gordon did not drive home the victory. It was also in this action we get the famous quote from Grant about Lee and the Army of the Potomac, seeming to think that he would hit them in both flanks and then somersault and hit them in the rear. To be fair to the situation, though, if Johnson had supported Gordon and the attack had seen additional brigades thrown in, Lee very well could have been able to roll up the Union troops, so he just might have been able to do that somersault into the Union rear. So we will conclude the Battle of the Wilderness. Lee's first combat with Grant would end the rebels settling into their defenses, daring the Union Army to try them again. In 2 days of combat, the Union Army had suffered 17,000 casualties compared to 11,000 Confederates. The cliche thing to say is that the rebels will ill afford to lose these men, but given the hampering Lee faced compared to the large northern numbers, this was not untrue. Both sides would suffer from the missed opportunity. Had Burnside been present with Hancock, Hill might have been completely destroyed. Indeed, if the attack had jumped off as Grant has designed, then things might have been very different. Lee, of course, will lament the loss of Longstreet and the flank attacks of Gordon and Sorrell. There might have been a real opportunity in both those places. Hill and Ewell would actually turn in good performances, but they would be supervised by Lee. As it was, Grant would not pull across the Rapidan. He was ready to fight again. He would try to wedge the Union Army between the Army of Northern Virginia and Richmond. This is going to force Lee to leave his earthworks and move. The target location would be a place called Spotsylvania Courthouse. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website, as well as Patreon and Venmo information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.